I raised my champagne glass at my medical school graduation dinner, watching my mother's satisfied smile as she thought I had not seen her slip the white powder into my drink. 26 years of her manipulation, 26 years of being the perfect daughter, and this was how she planned to celebrate my achievement. The dining room fell silent as I stood, my smile never wavering, knowing this moment would shatter everything my family believed about loyalty, love, and the golden child they had created. What they did not know was that I had been recording every family dinner for months, building evidence for something far more devastating than anyone could imagine. Before we dive into this shocking family betrayal, I want to know where you are watching from tonight. Are you as stunned as I was in that moment? Hit that like button if you have ever felt that chill when someone you trust shows their true colors, and do not forget to subscribe because this story gets so much darker than anyone could predict. The next part will reveal why my own mother wanted me unconscious on what should have been the proudest night of my life. My name is Seraphina, and I had spent my entire life being exactly what my family wanted me to be. Growing up in an affluent suburb of Chicago, I was the daughter who never missed curfew, never failed a test, never questioned why my younger brother Marcus got a new car, while I worked 3 jobs to pay for textbooks. My parents, Robert and Patricia Whitmore, had built their social standing on having the perfect family, and I was their crown jewel. The signs had been there for years, subtle manipulations I explained away as protective parenting. When I wanted to study abroad in college, suddenly my grandmother became critically ill and needed care. When I received a full scholarship to Harvard Medical School, my mother developed mysterious anxiety attacks whenever I mentioned moving to Boston. Every major opportunity in my life had been accompanied by a family crisis that required my immediate attention and sacrifice. But the real revelation came 6 months ago, when I discovered the trust fund my grandfather had left specifically for my education. $23 million that my parents had been managing since I turned 18. Money that could have paid for medical school 10 times over, while I struggled with student loans and worked myself to exhaustion. The fund had one stipulation: that my grandfather had insisted upon something my parents had hidden from me completely. According to the original documents I found hidden in my father's study, the money was mine unconditionally upon graduation from medical school. But there was a clause that terrified my parents. If anything happened to me before I turned 30, if I died or became permanently incapacitated, the money would go to medical research rather than returning to the family estate. My parents had been living off the interest for years, using it to maintain their lifestyle, pay for Marcus's expensive habits, and fund my father's failing investment firm. The poisoning tonight was not random. I had been experiencing strange episodes over the past year, moments of disorientation and memory loss that my family attributed to stress from medical school. But I had started documenting everything, recording conversations, saving every interaction, because something felt fundamentally wrong about their concern for my well-being. They were always present during my worst episodes, always ready with explanations and care that felt performative rather than genuine. What I discovered through careful investigation was a pattern of psychological and financial abuse that stretched back to my childhood. Every time I had shown independence or questioned their decisions, I would fall mysteriously ill or experience anxiety attacks that required their intervention. They had been conditioning me to depend on them while systematically stealing my inheritance and planning to incapacitate me permanently before I could claim what was rightfully mine. The white powder my mother slipped into my drink was not meant to kill me, but to cause enough neurological damage to declare me incompetent to manage my affairs. I had found the medical reports they had been forging documentation of a progressive neurological condition that would justify a conservatorship. My own family had been planning to destroy my mind and steal my future, using my graduation celebration as the perfect cover for their final betrayal. As I stood there with my poisoned champagne watching their expectant faces, I realized that everything I thought I knew about love, family, and loyalty had been an elaborate lie designed to keep me compliant until they could eliminate the threat I posed to their financial security. The perfect daughter they had created was about to become their worst nightmare, and they had no idea that their victim had been preparing for this moment for months. I did not drink the champagne. Instead, I set the glass carefully on the table and reached into my purse, pulling out a small recording device that had been capturing every word spoken at dinner. The color drained from my mother's face as I pressed play, and her voice filled the dining room with crystal clarity. The neurologist said the medication will cause gradual cognitive decline, but it needs to be administered consistently. Once she shows enough symptoms, we can have her declared incompetent and take control of everything. Robert, are you sure about the dosage? My father's voice followed cold and calculating in a way I had never heard before. The trust fund transfers next week. We just need her confused enough for long enough to establish the conservatorship. Marcus deserves his inheritance, and this medical school nonsense has gone on too long anyway. The silence that followed was deafening. My Aunt Sarah, who had flown in from Seattle for my graduation, stared at my parents with horror. My brother Marcus, who I had defended countless times against their favoritism, looked genuinely shocked. But it was my grandmother's reaction that broke my heart completely. She began crying not from surprise, but from relief. Seraphina, sweetheart, I have been trying to warn you for months, she whispered, her voice shaking. They threatened to put me in a facility if I told you about the trust fund. I tried to leave hints, tried to make you suspicious, but they were watching everything I did. I had prepared for this moment, but the reality of hearing my family's betrayal played back to them felt surreal. My mother tried to grab the recording device, claiming it was illegal and inadmissible, but I had consulted with lawyers months ago. Every recording had been made in public spaces or with consent from at least one party, me making them perfectly legal in Illinois. You want to know what else I found? I continued, pulling out a thick folder from my bag. Financial records showing how you have been living off my inheritance for 8 years. Medical reports you forged to support a neurological condition I do not have. Prescription records showing you have been obtaining psychiatric medications under false pretenses. And my personal favorite emails between you and Dr. Morrison, discussing how much medication would be needed to cause permanent cognitive impairment without triggering a murder investigation. My father's business associates, who had been invited to celebrate my achievement, began quietly excusing themselves from the table. The restaurant manager approached, clearly uncomfortable with the escalating situation, but I assured him that everything was under control and that law enforcement would be arriving shortly. Because I had not come alone tonight. While my family thought they were executing their final plan, I had been coordinating with the FBI Financial Crimes Unit for 3 months. Wire fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy to commit assault, and attempted theft of federal grant money were just the beginning of the charges that would be filed. The trust fund had been partially funded by government research grants, making their theft a federal crime with serious implications. My mother tried one last manipulation, tears streaming down her face as she begged me to understand that everything they did was out of love and concern for my future. She claimed that I was too trusting, too naive to handle such a large inheritance, and that they were protecting me from making terrible financial decisions. But I had learned to recognize her performances, and this desperate plea felt as hollow as every other lie she had told me. The most devastating revelation came when I confronted Marcus directly. "Did you know about the trust fund?" I asked him quietly, giving him one chance to claim innocence in their scheme. His answer destroyed the last piece of my childhood innocence. "I thought you knew, and were just being selfish about it. They told me you were hoarding Grandpa's money while they struggled to pay for my education. I figured you deserved whatever they were planning." Even my brother, who I had protected and defended throughout our childhood, had been turned against me by our parents' manipulation. They had convinced him that I was the villain in this story, the greedy daughter who refused to share family resources while he suffered. The truth was that Marcus had received over $200,000 from my trust fund for his education and lifestyle money that I had never known existed while I worked multiple jobs and accumulated debt. The FBI agents arrived exactly as planned, led by Special Agent Maria Rodriguez, who had been investigating my family's financial activities as part of a larger fraud case. What I had not expected was learning that my situation was not unique. Agent Rodriguez explained that my parents had been under investigation for similar schemes involving two other families' cases where they had manipulated estate planning and medical care to fraudulently obtain inheritances. My Aunt Sarah immediately offered to testify against my parents, revealing that she had suspected their financial manipulation for years but had no proof. She told me about conversations where my mother had hinted about having to handle my inheritance situation, comments Sarah had dismissed as stress about my future until tonight's revelation. She also provided financial records showing suspicious transfers between my parents' accounts and offshore holdings that aligned perfectly with the timeline of my trust fund theft. The restaurant had cleared out except for our immediate family and the federal agents, creating an intimate setting for the complete destruction of everything I had believed about my life. But as devastating as the betrayals felt, I also experienced an unexpected sense of liberation. Every doubt I had suppressed, every instinct I had ignored, every moment when something felt wrong about my family's behavior, suddenly made perfect sense. Agent Rodriguez informed me that my parents' financial crimes extended far beyond my trust fund. They had been operating a consulting business that specialized in estate planning for wealthy families, using their access to manipulate inheritances and medical decisions for their own benefit. My case was particularly egregious because of the long-term psychological manipulation and attempted poisoning, but it was part of a pattern that had been developing for over a decade. The most shocking discovery came when Agent Rodriguez showed me evidence that my parents had attempted similar schemes with my cousins on my father's side. My cousin Jennifer, who had died in a car accident 3 years ago, had been displaying signs of neurological impairment in the months before her death. The accident investigation had been cursory because there was no suspected foul play, but the FBI was now reopening the case based on the pattern of behavior my situation had revealed. My grandmother, who had been silent through most of the federal investigation, finally spoke up with information that changed everything. She revealed that my grandfather's trust fund included specific provisions that would invalidate the inheritance if any family member was found to be manipulating or harming the beneficiary. He had apparently suspected that his son Robert might attempt financial manipulation, so he had included language that would transfer the money directly to charity if any fraud was discovered. This meant that not only had my parents been stealing from me, but they had also been risking the complete loss of the inheritance through their criminal behavior. Their greed had blinded them to the very real possibility that their actions would leave them with nothing, a irony that was not lost on anyone in the room. But the most significant alliance formed that night was with Dr. Elizabeth Kane, a forensic psychiatrist who had been consulting with the FBI on the case. She explained that my parents had been employing sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques, essentially gaslighting me for years to maintain control over my decisions and finances. The medical episodes I had experienced were likely caused by low-dose poisoning designed to create dependency and confusion without causing immediate suspicion. Dr. Kane offered to provide comprehensive psychological evaluation and therapy to help me process the trauma of discovering that my entire family structure had been built on lies and manipulation. She also connected me with support groups for adult survivors of financial abuse, helping me understand that my experience was part of a recognizable pattern of family-based financial crimes. As the evening progressed, I realized that my parents' betrayal had actually freed me to build authentic relationships for the first time in my adult life. My Aunt Sarah, who had been kept at arm's length by my parents' manipulation, immediately offered her support and guidance. Agent Rodriguez provided resources for victim services and financial recovery. Dr. Kane outlined a path toward psychological healing that felt genuine rather than performative. The federal investigation would take months to complete, but I was no longer facing it alone. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who supported my independence rather than trying to control it, people who celebrated my achievements rather than using them as opportunities for manipulation. The family I had lost through this betrayal was being replaced by chosen relationships built on honesty and mutual respect. My trust fund would be frozen during the investigation, but the FBI assured me that recovering my stolen inheritance was a priority. More importantly, the evidence we had gathered would prevent my parents from victimizing other families, bringing some meaning to the trauma I had endured. The perfect daughter they had created was about to become the instrument of their complete destruction, and I was finally ready to embrace that role completely. 3 months into the federal investigation, I discovered that trust could be weaponized, even by those who claimed to support me. Dr. Elizabeth Kane, the forensic psychiatrist who had become my therapist and strongest advocate, revealed her true intentions during what I thought was a routine session. She had been secretly working with my parents' defense team, gathering privileged information from our therapy sessions to build their case for diminished capacity. The revelation came accidentally when I arrived early for an appointment and overheard her phone conversation with my father's attorney. She was discussing my psychological state, sharing details from our confidential sessions, and strategizing about how to present me as an unreliable witness who had fabricated evidence due to paranoid delusions. The woman who had helped me understand my trauma was simultaneously using that trauma to discredit my testimony. Her attachment issues make her prone to conspiracy thinking, Dr. Kane was saying into her phone. I can testify that her allegations against her parents stem from documented abandonment fears and a pattern of misinterpreting protective behavior as controlling. The recordings she made show clear signs of confirmation bias rather than actual evidence of criminal behavior. I stood frozen in the hallway, recording every word on my phone as she continued outlining how my psychological vulnerability could be used to dismiss the federal charges against my parents. She had been playing both sides from the beginning, earning my trust while gathering ammunition to destroy my credibility. The therapeutic relationship I had relied on for healing was actually another layer of manipulation designed to protect my parents from prosecution. When I confronted Dr. Kane directly, she did not even attempt to deny her duplicity. Instead, she calmly explained that my parents had hired her months before our first meeting, tasking her with building a psychological profile that would support their defense strategy. Every breakthrough we had achieved in therapy, every moment of vulnerability I had shared, had been carefully documented and analyzed for weaknesses they could exploit in court. Your parents genuinely believe they were protecting you, she said with clinical detachment. The financial arrangements were complicated, but their intentions were never malicious. You have been struggling with paranoid ideation since childhood, and this investigation has exacerbated those tendencies into full conspiracy theories. The betrayal felt even more devastating than my parents' original deception because I had voluntarily trusted Dr. Kane with my deepest fears and traumas. She had encouraged me to explore my family relationships, to question my perceptions, to acknowledge my emotional responses, all while secretly building a case that would paint me as mentally unstable and unreliable. Agent Rodriguez was furious when I reported Dr. Kane's ethical violations and her compromised role in the investigation. The FBI immediately launched an internal review of how confidential witness information had been shared, and Dr. Kane's license came under review for multiple professional violations. But the damage had already been done to the federal case, and my parents' defense team now had detailed psychological ammunition to use against me. My Aunt Sarah tried to provide emotional support during this second betrayal, but I found myself questioning everyone's motives and wondering who else might be secretly working against me. The paranoid thinking that Dr. Kane had accused me of actually began manifesting as a protective response to the repeated violations of trust I had experienced. My ability to form new relationships became compromised by the legitimate fear that anyone claiming to help me might have hidden agendas. The most painful aspect of Dr. Kane's betrayal was how it retroactively poisoned every moment of progress I had felt during our sessions. Conversations where I had felt understood and validated were actually sessions where my vulnerabilities were being cataloged and weaponized. The therapeutic insights that had helped me understand my family dynamics were twisted into evidence of psychological instability rather than healthy recognition of abuse patterns. My parents' defense strategy became clear during the preliminary hearings. They would argue that I had misinterpreted normal family financial management as criminal conspiracy due to underlying mental health issues exacerbated by the stress of medical school. Dr. Kane's testimony would paint me as an unreliable narrator whose accusations stemmed from psychological dysfunction rather than actual evidence of financial crimes. The federal case that had seemed so solid 3 months ago now faced serious credibility challenges. My recordings were dismissed as the products of paranoid surveillance, and my documentation was characterized as obsessive behavior, rather than legitimate evidence gathering. Even my academic achievements were reframed as symptoms of perfectionist anxiety that had distorted my perception of family dynamics. But what my parents and Dr. Kane had not anticipated was how their betrayal would motivate me to dig deeper into their criminal activities. If they wanted to paint me as paranoid and obsessive, I would give them documentation so thorough and evidence so comprehensive that my psychological state would become irrelevant to the overwhelming proof of their guilt. Their attempt to discredit me had actually strengthened my resolve to expose every aspect of their criminal enterprise. The alliance that had felt so supportive and empowering had revealed itself as another layer of manipulation, but this betrayal also clarified exactly who my real enemies were and what tactics they were willing to employ. Dr. Kane's duplicity had shown me that my parents' corruption extended far beyond financial crimes into professional ethics violations and witness tampering. Their desperation was becoming their weakness, and I was learning to weaponize their mistakes against them. My salvation came from an unexpected source: my cousin Jennifer's former roommate, who had been following news coverage of my case and recognized disturbing parallels to Jennifer's death 3 years earlier. Emma Martinez contacted Agent Rodriguez directly, providing evidence that would transform our understanding of my parents' criminal enterprise and vindicate every suspicion I had harbored about my family's involvement in Jennifer's mysterious deterioration. Emma had kept detailed records of Jennifer's final months, including photographs, medical records, and recordings of conversations where Jennifer expressed fear about her family's sudden interest in her medical care. What emerged was a pattern identical to my own experience: mysterious neurological symptoms, family members insisting on managing medical appointments, and a gradual transfer of financial control to relatives who claimed to be protecting Jennifer's interests. The most damning evidence came from Jennifer's personal journal, which Emma had preserved after her death. Jennifer had documented episodes of confusion and memory loss that began shortly after she inherited money from a different grandparent, episodes that occurred primarily after family dinners or gatherings. She had started questioning whether someone was drugging her, suspicions she shared only with Emma because she feared her family would use those concerns as evidence of mental instability. "My parents keep talking about how I need help managing my money," Jennifer had written in her final entry. "Uncle Robert suggested I give him power of attorney until I feel better, but something about the way he looks at me makes my skin crawl. Emma thinks I should get blood tests done somewhere they do not know me, but I am scared of what we might find." Jennifer never got those independent blood tests. She died in a single-car accident 2 weeks later, an accident that occurred during one of her episodes of confusion and disorientation. The investigating officers had found no evidence of foul play, but they had not been looking for signs of poisoning or medical manipulation because no one suspected family involvement in her deteriorating condition. Emma's evidence provided the missing piece that transformed my case from isolated financial fraud into a pattern of serial criminal behavior spanning multiple victims over several years. Agent Rodriguez immediately reopened Jennifer's death investigation and began examining other suspicious deaths and medical emergencies within families my parents had advised on estate planning. The breakthrough came when forensic accountants discovered that my parents had received substantial consulting fees from Jennifer's estate after her death payments that were disguised as grief counseling services, but actually represented compensation for facilitating the inheritance transfer to more distant relatives. They had profited directly from Jennifer's death while maintaining the appearance of providing emotional support to a grieving family. But the most powerful new ally emerged when Dr. Sarah Kim, a toxicologist who had been following the case through professional networks, offered to provide expert testimony about the long-term effects of low-dose poisoning. Dr. Kim had been researching pharmaceutical abuse in family settings and recognized the symptom patterns I described as consistent with systematic poisoning designed to cause cognitive impairment without triggering immediate medical suspicion. Dr. Kim's analysis of my medical records revealed evidence of heavy metal poisoning that had been accumulating in my system for over 2 years. Blood work that my family doctor had ordered during my episodes of confusion had shown elevated levels of arsenic and lead, but those results had been explained away as environmental exposure or stress-related changes. Dr. Kim demonstrated that the levels and timing patterns were consistent with deliberate administration rather than accidental exposure. Someone has been poisoning you systematically, Dr. Kim explained during our first meeting. The dosages were carefully calculated to cause neurological symptoms without triggering acute poisoning protocols. This represents sophisticated knowledge of toxicology and access to pharmaceutical-grade substances that would not be available to casual poisoners. Her testimony would prove that my family's medical manipulation was not limited to psychological abuse, but included actual chemical poisoning, designed to cause the very neurological damage they claimed to be protecting me from. The irony was devastating. They had been creating the medical conditions they planned to use as justification for taking control of my inheritance. Dr. Kim also provided connections to other toxicology experts who had encountered similar cases, building a network of professional witnesses who could testify about the patterns of family-based poisoning and medical manipulation. Their testimony would establish that my experience was part of a recognized category of financial crimes that specifically targeted inheritance situations through medical incapacitation of beneficiaries. The evidence became overwhelming when digital forensics experts recovered deleted emails from my parents' computers, showing detailed research into untraceable poisons discussions with Dr. Kane about psychological manipulation techniques and coordination with estate planning attorneys about legal strategies for managing incapacitated beneficiaries. They had been planning my destruction for years, researching methods and building professional networks to support their criminal enterprise. Agent Rodriguez assembled a prosecution team that included specialists in financial crimes, medical fraud, and elder abuse, creating a comprehensive legal strategy that addressed every aspect of my parents' criminal behavior. The case expanded beyond my individual situation to encompass pattern evidence from multiple families, transforming a single inheritance theft into a federal racketeering investigation with multiple victims and extensive financial damages. My cousin Jennifer's case was officially reclassified as a homicide investigation, with my parents designated as primary suspects in her death. The consulting fees they had received from her estate were frozen as evidence, and other families they had advised were contacted for potential victim interviews. What had begun as my personal fight for justice had exposed a criminal enterprise that had been operating undetected for years. The alliance I had lost through Dr. Kane's betrayal was replaced by a network of professionals whose expertise and integrity had been thoroughly vetted. Emma Martinez became both a friend and a fellow survivor, someone who understood the specific trauma of losing family members to financial predators. Dr. Kim provided medical advocacy that was genuinely focused on my healing rather than evidence gathering for opposing legal strategies. The trial lasted 6 weeks, and every day brought new revelations about the scope of my parents' criminal enterprise. They had been operating what federal prosecutors called a family destruction network, targeting wealthy families with complex inheritance structures and systematically destroying beneficiaries who posed threats to financial manipulation opportunities. My case was the most extensively documented, but evidence emerged of at least 12 other families who had been victimized over a 15-year period. My mother was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for wire fraud conspiracy, attempted murder, and racketeering. My father received 30 years for his leadership role in the criminal organization and his direct involvement in Jennifer's death, which was ultimately classified as premeditated murder. Dr. Kane lost her medical license and received a 10-year sentence for conspiracy and professional ethics violations that had enabled multiple felonies. But the most satisfying moment came when Marcus testified against our parents in exchange for immunity from prosecution. He had finally understood that their manipulation had extended to him as well, that his inheritance had been contingent on my destruction, and that they had been grooming him to continue their criminal enterprise with future victims. His testimony revealed the psychological techniques they had used to turn us against each other and maintain control over family dynamics. They told me that Seraphina was selfish and ungrateful, Marcus explained to the jury. They convinced me that she was hoarding family money, while I struggled that she had always been the favorite who received advantages I was denied. I realize now that they were creating conflict between us to prevent us from comparing our experiences and discovering their manipulation. The financial recovery exceeded even my expectations. Beyond my original $23 million inheritance, the court awarded additional damages for the years of theft, psychological trauma, and attempted murder. The civil suits against their estate planning business resulted in another $40 million in penalties and victim compensation. My parents' assets were completely liquidated to pay restitution to the families they had destroyed. More importantly, the investigation led to changes in estate planning oversight and medical safeguards that would protect future victims from similar abuse. Federal regulations now require independent medical evaluation for inheritance beneficiaries showing sudden neurological symptoms, and estate planning attorneys face enhanced scrutiny when managing accounts for clients with suspicious medical conditions. My recovery process involved intensive therapy with Dr. Rachel Torres, a trauma specialist whose credentials and independence I thoroughly verified before beginning treatment. She helped me understand that my hypervigilance and trust issues were appropriate responses to systematic betrayal rather than symptoms of psychological dysfunction. Healing meant acknowledging the reality of what I had survived while building healthy relationships with people who deserved my trust. The chosen family I built in the aftermath of my biological family's destruction became more fulfilling than any relationship I had experienced during my controlled childhood. Emma Martinez and I became close friends, bonded by our shared experience of family-based trauma and our commitment to supporting other survivors. Agent Rodriguez became a mentor who helped me understand my strength and resilience. Dr. Kim became both a professional colleague and personal friend who supported my decision to specialize in forensic toxicology. My medical career flourished in ways I had never imagined possible when I was constrained by family expectations and financial manipulation. I completed a fellowship in forensic pathology and began working with law enforcement to identify and prosecute cases of medical abuse within family systems. My personal experience with systematic poisoning provided unique insight into crime patterns that other investigators might overlook. 6 months after the trial concluded, I received a letter from another young woman whose family had been manipulating her inheritance through similar medical tactics. She had recognized the patterns from news coverage of my case and reached out for guidance about building evidence and protecting herself. Helping her navigate the investigation process and connect with appropriate resources gave meaning to my trauma and purpose to my survival. The graduation dinner that was supposed to be my destruction became the beginning of my authentic life. The trust fund that my parents had stolen funded not only my freedom, but also a foundation dedicated to supporting survivors of family-based financial abuse. The medical degree I earned, despite their sabotage, became the foundation for a career dedicated to justice and protection of vulnerable individuals. I kept the recording device that captured my mother poisoning my drink not as evidence anymore, but as a reminder of the moment I chose to fight rather than submit to their control. That decision to stand and smile instead of drinking the poison saved not only my life, but also the lives of future victims who would have suffered if their criminal enterprise had continued operating. Looking back now, I realize that their betrayal was actually a gift that freed me from a lifetime of manipulation and allowed me to discover my authentic self. The family I lost through their criminality was replaced by chosen relationships built on honesty, respect, and genuine care. The inheritance they tried to steal became the foundation for a life dedicated to protecting others from similar abuse. My story proves that justice is possible even when the people who should protect you become your greatest threat. Family loyalty should never require tolerating abuse, and blood relationships do not justify criminal behavior or financial exploitation. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand up to the people who claim to love you when their actions prove otherwise. If you have experienced family-based manipulation or financial abuse, know that you are not alone and that recovery is possible. If you have seen patterns in your own family that remind you of my story, trust your instincts and seek independent support. Sometimes the people closest to us are capable of the greatest betrayals, but that does not mean we are powerless to protect ourselves and seek justice. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own safety? Have you experienced that moment when you realized that someone you trusted was actively working against your interests? Share your thoughts in the comments because these conversations help all of us recognize manipulation and support each other through recovery. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help others find it who might need to hear this message. Subscribe for more stories about survival justice and the strength we find when we refuse to be victims. Share this video with anyone who might benefit from understanding that family dysfunction can be overcome and that chosen families can be more supportive than biological ones. Thank you for listening to my journey from victim to survivor to advocate. I hope my experience helps you recognize that you deserve relationships built on honesty and respect, whether those relationships are with family members who earn your trust or chosen family who supports your authentic self. Remember that seeking justice is not about revenge, but about protecting yourself and others from continued harm. You are stronger than you know, and you deserve better than manipulation disguised as love.